Are we beginning? Do I begin? Is this actually working? I never believe in these things. All this technology and stuff. It's very strange to me, always. Is that the right height, do you think? Well, I don't know. I'll have it go. It's actually 9:44, and we were supposed to start at 9 o'clock, as we know. So, I mean, we're well within time. The evening was going to be called a prefabricated dinner, but someone suggested this sounded as if it was uneatable, so no one would come. So we changed it to high tech, which was a slightly forced title. It occurred to me about 2 minutes ago, talking to Hugh Morris, who's actually going to continue much more efficiently than I'm doing in a moment or two, that really what this evening is about cross-fertilization, and I wonder whether that was a thing you could actually say nowadays, but still. But it's a matter of actually the connection between what was a moment when I suppose English architecture was at a high peak. I mean, even A.M.Gear came to Hertfordshire to have their amazing bean feast. I remember going there with about 10 other AA students, and there was Corb and Gropius and Shamayev and all the great names, and they were so furious about our gate crashing that the next A.M. conference, I remember, was held on a yacht, and we didn't go to that. I'm not going to say very much, excepting that the effect, no, I don't know, one should really reminisce at all, but I'd like to say that when I was a child, when I wanted to be a farmer, not an architect, I remember lorries going by with prefabricated houses, and one thought, gosh, isn't this amazing? This is the building of the future. These marvellous houses on lorries, one after another, coming up from Bristol and wherever Archon houses were built. And then I remember being here, and I was taken by a great man, Brian Adams, who isn't here, unfortunately, who I suppose was the only man in British industry who, no, I should be corrected by this. But I remember he took me out to see David Mead at a school we just completed, and he was saying, we were pointing out everything from the light fittings and the floors and the door handles and the heating and the structure had been designed by one group of people. And this was sensational, really. And I suppose it's really architecture in the old mode, because today I'm always worrying about choosing which door handle I want to use out of what catalogue. The idea of actually designing my own door handle and getting it made, is really quite amazing. I don't want to go on reminiscing in this way, but it was just that it did seem at that point that architecture was incredibly exciting. It's very exciting today in a different way, but I feel maybe this evening might do the cross-fertilization bit. I want to hand over to Hugh Morris, great past president, and I forgot to ask you when you were president, but anyway, it was not too long ago. Forgot. And to introduce our amazing speakers for this evening.
If I can speak sitting down, being a bit prefabricated, pin-jointed and sprung-braced, it's safer. I won't try to explain the title for this evening, which is, to say the least, cryptic. It's John Priceman's. It tells you on the menu what the four speakers are going to talk about. I have no qualifications for chairing at all, except that John Priceman asked me to do it, and that I've sort of been around rather persistently since 1945, which puts me just nicely in the sort of historical bracket as a watcher and an interested person in the lightweight, versatile Meccano set end of the prefabrication story, which is one of the themes of this evening. In fact, I'd say that the AA, as far as I know, carries no banner for any particular sort of tech, high, low, or whatever. If it has a banner, it's presumably the proper one in pursuit of appropriate technology. But this evening's title will do, and it gives us a thread. And I suggest that thread is the key word is simply prefabrication. Bruce will talk about the school building story primarily. A.M.Gear about prefabricated housing during and after the war, especially Archon. Martin Richardson about housing, especially the Yorkshire Development Group, but also his own 60s work and his own work in the 70s. And Richard Rogers may talk about anything. I hope his approach to some of his more recent projects. Chronologically, A.M.Gear ought to start because the prefabricated housing work got going during, not after the war. They shuffled the order, and because the subject includes the school's experience and the housing experience. They are very different, and what makes Jim's story with a bit of a jump to Martin's is the housing theme, which is very different from and very much more complicated, I think, than the school's story. So they're together in the middle. John Postman and I and Gang of Four met for lunch last week, and if that was anything to go by, we may well be here till midnight tonight. One thing we did agree was that the tenor of the evening should be history rather than futurology or speculation. But in this, we're not trying to look ahead. We're trying to look back in the sense of learning a bit, because I think in this place there are two complementary, some would say contradictory attitudes towards history. There always have been. One is Goldwyn's history is bunk, which sounds crude, but when you think about it, I think it's very sophisticated at this point, because as it were, my bunk is not your bunk. The other is that history is useful and full of lessons for the present and the future, and I expect some of those will emerge from these 4 brief shots at telling it how it really was. They will, of course, be personal, highly personal accounts, I would expect, and not ponderous attempts at historical objectivity, whatever that is. Before I stop to let Bruce start, I would suggest one slightly dangerous generalization about architectural history, which the past 40 years seems to me to demonstrate, to do with zeitgeist and all that. In any period of social, political, and cultural optimism, architects are bold and hopeful about technical and formal innovation, and that goes for Russian constructivists in the early 1920s, or for the AA or Harts in the 40s. And in periods of political pessimism, cynicism, and fearfulness, like now, we tend to backpedal, to seek new inspiration from the past, to, if you like, indulge in historicism, if you want to be rude about it, or learn sensibly from my grandfather's wisdom if you want to be polite. We're rather zeitgeist haunting. Therefore, it now requires, I think, a considerable effort to recall or to convey the start point of this evening, the general atmosphere of things in the immediate post-war years, if you were there, and an even greater effort of the imagination and a lot of listening to conceive what it was like if you weren't there. I want to use 2 quotes to try and, what do you do with ghosts? Summon them up from 1945. The first one is from D.H. Lawrence, which I found by accident the other day, and I couldn't make out where on earth it came from, but checked out and found it came from Etruscan Faces, 1932. D.H. Lawrence, sort of thing that students like I were reading in the just after war. Lawrence writes, myself, I like to think of little wooden temples of the early Greeks and of the Etruscans, small, fragile, and evanescent as flowers. We've reached the stage when we are weary of huge stone erections. We begin to realize it is better to keep life fluid and changing rather than to try to hold it fast down in heavy monuments, burdens on the face of the earth on man's ponderous erections, he says, and I skip a paragraph, and he goes on. Why has mankind had such a craving to be imposed upon? Why this lust after imposing creeds, imposing deeds, imposing buildings, imposing language, imposing works of art? The thing becomes an imposition and a weariness at last. Give us things that are alive and flexible, which won't last too long and become an obstruction and a weariness. Even Michelangelo becomes at last a lump and a burden and a bore. That, to me, conveys a particular aspect of the immediate post-war feeling. The other is less than literary distinction, but it comes from Henry Swain, who ought to be here tonight and isn't. And he wrote recently, last year, in a speech in memory of Sir Johnson Marshall, whose name I can't up this evening. He wrote, I can remember the moment in 1948 when the 4th year of the AA school visited the almost completed first Hertfordshire post-war primary school, Chesham in Essendon. I'd never seen buildings like this before. As a student in the AA, I was, of course, familiar with the gods of the modern movement in architecture, reinforced concrete buildings of Texel and Paul, and Williams, Craftwork buildings of Boise and Lloyd Wright. Here was something totally and magically different. Glass, light steel frames, precast concrete, beautifully designed service pipes, clear primary colours, the whole lot coming off factory assembly lines. Things I now take for granted in the design of infant schools, then leapt at me. Little chairs, 12 inches high, low windowsills for children to see out of, child-sized lavatories and wash basins. There was a total unity of architectural and technical thinking, and above all, unprecedentedly, the idea that schools were for the children, indeed the delight of small children, for the education, sorry, indeed the delight of small children. And finish that one off. What I remember now about the early Hart schools was how completely unprecedented they were. Maturer judgment would perhaps say they owed something to Barts and Castlewood and Powerhouse and British College. In all honesty, this didn't strike me at the time. They were decisively different from any contemporary buildings or anything built in the past. They were new because they were an answer to today's problems uncluttered by yesterday's thinking. And this is what I've been trying to get to. Sorry it takes so long. Perhaps this stanza by Auden, who welcomed and enjoyed today's world and never looked over his shoulder, sums up that message. For us, like any other fugitive, like the numberless flowers that cannot number, and all the beasts that need not remember, it is today in which we live. Now, Lawrence's second paragraph, I think you can characterize several ways. One readily recognizable in 1945, and the reason why I wrote it down was his passion for the anti-fascist. And that takes a bit of remembering, but the way of looking at it. You could also look at it if you really care, and rather interestingly, for its contemporary topical feminist ring, all that over scorn for man's ponderous erections. A very dearish Lawrence. Henry Strains reflects, I think, the same scorn for monuments, for the individual genius and cultivation of the imposing. But in Auden's line, the sheer impatience of 1948, born of so many years wasted in war, is what it brings back, and that was actually the note I wanted to get to. You could say, very crudely, that jam today was the cry, and jam for every man, if not every woman. So with that, I would introduce Bruce Martin, who was here before and after the war with David, Ned, and who was hoiked into Hertfordshire in 1946, and who also was the designer, like Gilbert Scott, of the GPO telephone kiosk. I think it's the only thing he's got in common with Gilbert Scott, but that'll do for you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I had this brief about 6 weeks ago, and on the whole, I tend to look ahead, and this obliged me to look backwards, which is unusual. And also, I'm not basically a historian. I don't, on the whole, respect historians very much. However, I was asked to talk about Hertfordshire schools and to say what was the real achievement, what actually happened, what were the real motivations, what guided us, and how did it come about that we actually used prefabrication and not some other method? After all, you've seen next door what they were all building at the time. If you don't mind, I'm going to basically read this because I want to keep the actual quotations that I picked up from records. But if you'll permit me, I will nevertheless intersperse if I find there's an idea that I still want to get across. So in 1962, the Hertfordshire County Council published a booklet following the completion of the first 200 schools after 10 years' work. In their introduction, they say, this is 10 years later, in retrospect, perhaps the most significant facts were the foresight and boldness of all those responsible for the decisions taken at the time. A prolonged period of shortage of both traditional materials and building craftsmen was clearly foreseen. How wrong can you get? Foresight and boldness are not facts anyway. They don't provide the basis for taking decisions. They weren't the characteristics of the people who were there. That was quite different. If I had to try and say what our characteristics were, I think we were practical, we were ruthless, and we were soaked in idealism. We didn't foresee anything. We were empiricists, and we tried to get on and solve the problem. In Focus 1, published in the summer of 38, we had written, and I rather think it was Tony Cox who wrote this, because I think at the time he was editor. We were born in the war, the first war, that is. Much that follows in this journal can be oriented to that one fact. We were born into a civilization whose leaders, whose ideals, whose generation, whose culture had failed. They are still in power today. We, the generation who follow, cannot accept their domination. They lead always deeper into a reaction that we're convinced can only end in disaster. So we were followers of Le Corbusier, Frank Lloyd Wright, who incidentally had visited the AA in the month before war broke out, 1939. I remember I followed him around the library upstairs, and he stood in front of the window, and he said, "There's the great book, the book of nature. Books, burn 'em." So, alto, asplund, gropius. I might have more to say about alto later. In the same issue of Focus, I had translated Le Corbusier's lecture on the teaching of architecture. It begins, "The immense future of modern architecture, which is, after all, the equipment of a new civilization, should not have to be mixed up with vested interests. Life is just beginning for a new architecture, and it has a long life ahead of it." And then, of course, the war broke out, so that life was cut short. Throughout the long years of the Second World War, we looked forward to the new age and thought hard about what would have to be done. As many of you know, picture post and all that sort of thing, we were absolute hive of thinking. We hated war, and we hated its destruction. We wanted only to build, and we looked forward to that time. It happens that I kept a careful diary for many years. I find I was persuaded to go to Hartford by David Ned, and I started work at the new county hall on the 3rd of September, 46. As an aside, we were in Lubetkin's flat at High Point. I remember this, and we were in the sofa there, and David tried to persuade me, and I said, "Hang it, I'm not going into a bureaucratic public office. I'm going to be a private architect." Anyway, he won. We were to build some new schools, and on the 15th of November, that's about 3 months later, we have this. Morrison called together Bill, that was William Henderson of Farm and Dark, Lacey, Dan Lacey, you all know, David Med, Mary Med, and myself, Cox being in town, Anthony Cox, to prevent us with the 1947 schools program. So that was it. That was the end of 46. And it was as simple as that, just 6 of us asked to get on with the program. The method of construction had still to be developed. And the program, of course, was due to the education officer. He insisted he had 10 new schools next year and 20 the next and 20 after that. And everybody said, "That's perfectly stupid." And the county architect said, "Before the war, I only built 1 school a year." And Newsom said, "Nonsense, you're going to build, we've got to have 20 schools." So that was it. On 2nd of January, I have a note that said, "Met the principal of Maidstone School of Art." I don't know what that's got to do with it. But went to Med's house, analysis and study of the 9'5" stanchion details on the infant school. There were 50 of these, and they were all different. Report on a possible universal stanchion made in 3 heights. Bed, 1:15 a.m. This piece of work, curiously enough, was the key to the production lock from which the whole program could get underway. Now, I'd better just say what the lock was in a few words. One school wanted 200 columns. 10 schools wanted 2,000 columns. Every column up till then was a separate drawing by an engineer. We therefore wanted 2,000 drawings. The draftsman in the office in Birmingham at the end of the war had 3 draftsmen. There was no way we would do 2,000 drawings. We wouldn't have our program for another 5 years. We wanted to get on the ground 6 months later. So we had to find a way of cutting down the 2,000 drawings, and that's what the study was. And the study was that if we could in fact find a way of designing 3 columns which would meet every single situation in every possible school, then we could get underway into production. So that was the technical side, and that was worked out in 3 months. The requirements then were to build 10 schools in about a year's time. The production methods that had been used so effectively to make weapons for destruction on a vast scale were to be used to make building components. I can't help remembering Le Corbusier's pavilion in the 1937 exhibition, where he had put in his beautiful Corbusier stencil on a bright red canvas wall: "Des canons, des munitions, merci, des logis, s'il vous plaît." And he was right. The schools were designed to be assembled from ranges of parts mass-produced by the thousand. They were designed by careful, hard, rational, methodical study. We'd come together from many sectors of the war effort and had a wide range of expertise. We knew how to make things happen. We had made things happen. We knew what we were aiming for. We were going to build new schools for new education, new bottles for new wine. Now, very quickly, I'll just show you some of the bottles. Can we have the slides? This is the dining room of the prototype. I expect this is what Henry Swain was referring to earlier. Next, please. Upside down. One of the main corridors. Next, please. Each of the schools, in fact, it's fair to say practically every school in the Hertfordshire years was the full and complete responsibility of one architect. He was only responsible to the county architect direct. He was totally responsible for everything from the sketch plans, all consultation, all ordering materials, all design, all colour, all supervision, all site work, and right until the final accounts. And marvellous training, and also, I think, was partly responsible for the unity of individual schools. They obviously varied in quality, as individuals do vary in quality, but the fact is we had superb schools, we had middling schools, and we had very few that were poor. Next, please. One of the delightful things, of course, is that we were always building on large sites because in the Education Act, the playing fields were part of the school requirement. And in order to find the sufficient area, the sites were usually open sites. Looking back on it, of course, this had enormous advantages. We had none of the problems relating to historical buildings. We had none of, we didn't have town planning, of course, thank God. We had no planners, which was superb. We had no building regulations, which was first class. So altogether, we got on quite well. Next, please. This particular one was a very old, actually 16th century orchard, which happened to be in the middle of St. Albans. And very conveniently took an infant school. Next. One of the dining rooms. Next. Now this is 1951. This was development work where we switched to a meter grid, having previously been on 99 inches. And this was intended to be the next move forward. Next. Next. I think it probably goes without saying that we were inevitably enormously influenced by the Cubists, and above all by Picasso. There was a big London exhibition just after the war, and the colour, of course, was a prime study. We owed a lot to Aux Enfants, who lectured at the French Institute on colour. And that, of course, related also to Le Corbusier, who treated the colour, but the lighting particularly, very seriously. That's the lot. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Away the hour is approaching. And this was about what was to happen after the end of the war. And one of the things he said was that there was to be 500,000 emergency prefabricated houses built within 4 to 5 years at the end of the war. Well, we knew he was speaking about the Portal House, and we found out that in the Portal House, the outside cladding was clad in sheet steel. And if, indeed, that number of houses were built, there'd be no steel for motor cars, tin cans, and so on. So we wrote to Lord Portal, who was the Minister of Works, pointing this out to him. And he asked if we had any other suggestions. Well, as it happened, we had been working on a similar problem. And so we made a suggestion to him that this was an alternative. And he asked us to put one up in the Tate Gallery. Well, you can imagine that this was wartime. You couldn't get material. You couldn't get anyone to make anything. So it was a little difficult. And we had about 2 months to get this house up. Well, we managed to get it up. And if we may have the first slide. This was the house. The idea was that you had these demountable houses on stilts on the side. When you could build permanent houses, these houses were removed and a permanent prefabricated house was put in its place using the same drains, roads, and so on. And hopefully the same chap go back in it who'd built up his garden and his neighbours and so on. Well, that wasn't the ministry idea because, as you remember, they wanted to put these things on parks and so on, which was not what we had in mind. However, that's the plan. It's a very small building. It's about 570 square feet. The plumbing was a heart unit, a kitchen bathroom unit, which we designed for radiation. And the idea was that that was prefabricated as a unit, brought to the site on a low loader, and just dropped into position. You'll see on this plan, and on most of the plans, there's a lot of fittings and furniture and so on. And this was typical of housing at that time, where obviously it was going to be difficult to get furniture. So I wanted to reduce the amount of furniture to be supplied to the minimum. Next slide, please. Well, this is a model which, for some reason, was taken to Canada. But there's one of the little houses, and the site is shown this way to illustrate how these small Frankie piles provide you with a level surface. We went on trying to use piles on housing because it does divorce you from the irregularities of the ground, and it's easy to get a level surface. Next, please. This is the construction. I won't go into too much detail here, but the main structure is on two columns with the roof cantilevering out, the roof in tubes, rigidified by the gable ends, which were light steel framing. Light steel framing on both back and front, with external cladding of asbestos, with that profile which we'd worked out a year previously for various projects we had. And you see double asbestos, an airspace, an inch of fiberglass, and plasterboard. So the insulation was much better than an 11-inch cavity wall. But it's a pity the asbestos people, turners, we had that panel, which is based on the width of a blanket, an asbestos blanket, and the house indeed was on 3 feet grid based on the blanket. Unfortunately, when the ministry, I'll tell you about that later, when they changed our plan, they made us go onto a 2'11" grid, which meant that A, they wasted a lot of asbestos, and B, that the patterns which they'd used were not suitable for use after the war. So the asbestos industry didn't go on. Incidentally, I think they were stupid not to, but as you know, that sort of profile now is used by the aluminium and steel manufacturers. Next slide, please. This was the front of the house. Dustbin on one side and coal bin on the other, and that's the kitchen in front of it. And the back of the house. Next slide, please. Well, Lord Portal came onto the site, walked through the house with us, and turned around and said, put it on the ground, the front door in the middle, and I want 86,000 houses. So we went away. Obviously, we realized that we had to do a bit more than that. We were glad he said the front door in the middle, because the ministry plan, or Portal plan, which we didn't like, had the door side and was not a very pleasant plan anyway. So it gave us the opportunity of doing a new plan. So at this time, Parliament were getting concerned about these houses, which were the emergency houses. They were concerned that these houses were going to be put up and left up forever. They were also concerned that not many people were getting into the Act. So they decided that more people should be asked to provide solutions to this problem. And they would want to see another prototype. So this was July. So by September the 23rd, when Parliament reconvened, we had to redesign the house, draw out all the components, get them made and put up at another site, the State Gallery. Next. And this was our next plan. And that was again based on the 3-foot grid. The kitchen bathroom unit was the ministry unit, and that was not taken on the site in one unit, it was taken in pieces and assembled on the site. As you can see, there are many more cupboards in that than in the other suite. Better than our original plan, I think, got a separate WC, and it is a bit bigger. That is 650 square feet. That, again, was slightly bigger than the ministry because they cut a piece out where the kitchen is. They cut a slice out there to get away into a side door. Next slide, please. Well, this is the structure. This was purely a mock-up. We couldn't, in the time, possibly design for mass production. So the steel frame and so on, and just what we can get hold of. But again, we'd use the external cladding, we'd use the same kind of internal partitions. We streamlined the method of locating and lining up the panels. We improved the ceiling panels and the structure. This is just tubular roof trusses sitting on a steel frame. Next, please. This is the outside of the house, the back. When this was put out, we had people sitting listening to the various authorities, the local authorities who came around, MPs and so on, listening to criticisms. Unfortunately, most of the criticisms are things like they don't like glass at the bottom of the window because they get broken. So on the final house, that was filled in as solid. The snag of talking about houses in mass, so 86,000 houses, is every time you talk about anything like that little pagoda, everybody multiplies it by 86,000 and like to save a lot of money. Next slide. In this case, there's a little doorstep that cost £5,000, and that was cut out because, as you can imagine, it cost £10,600 on the 86,000 houses. So a lot of things were taken off like that and made the house rather miserable. Essentially, the colour of the house was fluorinated rubber paint, and it was a brown colour. The colour was selected by Ronnie Thomas, who picked a leaf up crossing Green Park. And we sent that to the manufacturers who very decently didn't complain. Next slide. This is one of the side doors. The whole thing was pretty well detailed and pretty neat. You can see the fixings. The outer fixings were toggle bolts, which were screwed in and out. Like, so you could take the sheets off if anything broke or anything. But, of course, we had the problem of would children take the sheets off if we left them like that. So there were little tiny studs, rather like the top of a billiard tube, pushed in afterwards. Next slide, please. And this is a perspective which Rod Thomas did, showing the houses in as far as you can imagine. It's not interesting that an MI5 gentleman came to see us. And we thought we might have selected somewhere which had some secret business, but he asked if he could have some of the photographs. They were going to drop them behind enemy lines to show the Belgians and so on what was going to happen in Britain after the war. And a number of these houses were put out in different parts of the world, in Cairo, Belgrade, incidentally, and other places where our troops are, Hamburg, to show the chaps. And we have a lot of letters from the people who put them up. Very interesting, the troubles they had, or troubles they didn't have. So anyway, there we were with that house. Now we were given, this was October of 44, and we were given till the end of December. Well, actually we had 6 weeks to do full working drawings, shop drawings, and everything else for another house, for the new scheme. Well, we managed to get to the following February, as it by a bit of argument. Incidentally, we were not looked on as a very decent chaps. We were always arguing about the difficulty of things. Next slide, please. The next house, which is now to the new dimensions, that's the standard Mark 5. Next slide, please. And that's the structure. Because we had so many ordered, we could there have the roll form sections specially designed and save a good deal of steel by doing that. The trusses that you see are still tubular. We went into a lot of problems on tolerances and corner techniques and color techniques and so on. Problems we'd learned to fight on the other jobs. Next slide. This is the cover technique, which is intended to take up tolerance from the wall panels. The I remember the chap designing that going frantic as we constantly changed the size of the timber panels because the government decided it had to come from Russia or Scandinavia or Canada or wherever it was, the scamping size had altered. And he at last said, for God's sake, put in an intercom and announce every 10 minutes the thickness of the wall panels. Anyway, eventually we got it done and got it up, and that was that particular next slide. Oh, I'm sorry, before we go, you can see that we had the switches pressed into the door surround and the socket outlet pressed into the skirtings. These things were just clipped on the bottom. But the corner connection had to be screwed on because it was necessary to get electrical continuity in the system. The electric wiring, as you see, went behind the curtain. Okay? Well, that was the house. As you see, we had designed another elephant here over the entrance door. You see how we got over the entrance door being in the middle? It wasn't actually, but there was a wall panel which was in the middle, part of which was wooden. Unfortunately, we couldn't find any substitute for chlorinated rubber paint to paint the actual cladding. So we had to, well, we didn't have to. We were made to leave it as it was. Now, I think that's, well, yes, I would say, no, this is, I think, another one. Yes? I think this is another slide. I see, I thought it was another one. I was going to tell you that these houses were put up at Crayford and Croydon, the first 100 houses, and they were used to take films of the erection and to time the erection and so on. Now, oh, yes, there was another one. Now, the erection of the house took 107 man-hours. Actually, it was 390 man-hours was allowed for bonus payments, but it was put up. In fact, one house was put up starting at 5 in the morning. They had a habitation certificate by midday. So that, but the houses to put up took between 8 and 10 months from the handover of the site, foundation and so on. And I put this in just to show why it took so long, from 390 hours to the finish of the job. This was a problem which we didn't tackle till after the Mark V. Now, I've only dealt with the design side. The problem with the organisation necessary to get these bits from the manufacturers onto the site, checking, preparing drawings of jigs and so on, were all done by Taylor Woodrose, who throughout the job employed 6,000 people on that side of it. We had about 20 people doing our bit. But it was an enormous task. They had 30 centres where they distributed, from which they distributed things, and collecting that stuff together was a fantastic business. Besides, as we said earlier, much of it was done during the wartime, when it was very, very difficult to get work done. Well, I have only one quotation in all this business. I'm getting hoarse, so I'll have to finish off anyway. If I can find it. Oh, no, I mustn't have any more of that. Thank you. I was thinking, this I found. Thank you. Mr. Seymour Cox, a socialist of Broxton, reported in the Express as saying of the Portal House, it is a rabbit hutch suitable only for Snow White and 3 of the 7 dwarfs, including Grumpy. Well, he was talking about the Portal plan, and as far as I know, the plan we had was quite satisfactory. We got a lot of letters, a lot of press releases, and in addition to which, in places like Bristol, people are still queuing up to go into the Portal houses when somebody dies or whatever. But if any of you are interested in seeing the house, Avon-Croft, which is a museum, building museum near Birmingham, Bromsgrove, on the 15th of March, will be opening an Archon house with the furniture of the period and what have you, alongside all their medieval buildings. And I hope that it would like. So if you want to see that, gentlemen, there you are. Well, thank you very much for this.
he had an uncle who had a house in Scotland, and he moved leaves, and he captured it by looking at Station 9, where they had some outdoor houses. And well, it lasted 5 years.
10 years. 10 years. Yes.
It will last. Because, you know, for £200 I can buy an outdoor house, I can erect it in my house, I can live in that, and I also get a refrigerator. I can put 7 refrigerators. So indeed, something like the problem was the windows of the hall were running. It was actually wide and turn the house around 50 minutes. We had to face the wall. We ended up buying 9 walls of terrace, so we'll take the 9 walls. Just saying, there's no, you can't kill up.
20 minutes each is something to observe. Not also worth marking other side of it, it's something to do because it's been noisy. And I would say that after the LCC housing movement in the 50s, where I know it was shortly after that in the 60s, I totally was going to work with Yorkshire Development Group on housing systems there. And that rather astonished me. I tried to imagine the situation. I saw it on film the other day in the form of the, as I imagined, I wasn't there, in the form of the first encounter between the small boy and the E.T., who, this is how I imagined it, who, as well in the film, silently look at each other for a minute and then scream. I often wondered how Martin, from the extraterrestrial south of Watford, managed with his Yorkshire and Nottinghamshire councillors and officers, the men of muck of the Labour Party and the men of brass from the Tory Party. Well, it's his story, and he must tell it. Martin.
As Hugh implied, this is the perhaps the heavy bit of the evening in several senses. I think the introduction on the events list is slightly misleading. It suggests there was a sort of smooth and continuous and sort of seamless story in schools and housing. When I joined the LCC in the mid-50s, there'd been quite a long interval, and the sort of prefabricated houses, which had flourished immediately after the war, and of course after the First World War, in a way were the product of a sort of weak situation, and things had got back to the sort of normalcy, it seemed, in the 50s. The valuer had been in charge of housing in the LCC in the 40s and had got a very large program going, which horrified the architects for its, I suppose, lack of quality. And they took over the design, production of housing. And the housing division became something of a sort of agreeable, progressive nursery school sense, where sometimes we felt it was more important that the individual architects should develop happily their ideas and develop their personalities, and that any particular number of housing should be produced. Perhaps we could start with the first slide. Can it be made any bigger or not? Not much. In the LCC, where this was not designed, as I said, there was this progressive atmosphere where it was important that each architect should somehow fulfill himself, which meant that each, not only each group of architects designed individually, but within each group, of which there were perhaps 20, each subgroup also redesigned, in effect, the same buildings. They redetailed the same buildings. And these buildings were normally components of mixed development, of which this is an example. Next, please. The concept behind this was one of fragmentation, really. It was socially separate separate groups of people, separate buildings. Each building was separately architected. Each was separately constructed, visually separate, spatially separate. And I found this, even in its best examples as a Roehampton, terribly disturbing and worrying. It was somehow irrational, disorientating. Next, please. And somehow I always found the basic fabric of old towns for its sort of continuity, integrity, reassuring, and a sort of touchstone. Next, please. I designed with a group of people for free sites in the LCC. We developed a sort of system of houses and flats which could be strung together along decks and arranged according to the shapes and the needs of each site. Next, please. In doing it, one began to find that by putting the units next to each other in a continuous way, whatever the size, and above each other, inevitably they had to relate in terms of dimensions and services. And it led one, rather naturally, to think of making bits which were so standardized in the factory. Next, please. Systems really tended to exist abroad at that time. We asked Kenneth Campbell, who was then in charge of the housing division, if we could investigate systems for this method of housing for different sites. He said, we tried it after the war, it's too expensive, it's no good. But in fact, investigations were going ahead, but systems, as they existed, tended to be next to really the panelization of slab blocks. Next, please. You subdivided a slab into a set of bits which could then only produce that slab. There was really it wasn't a Lego, it wasn't a flexible concept, it wasn't a sort of a system that one could understand, at least as an architect. It was simply a way of prefabricating once a day a set of panels out of which you could only make the same model aeroplane. There was no alternative possible. Next, please. I had an opportunity in the LTC of working on that sort of system, and in fact worked on Morris Walk in Woolwich, where one was also obliged to develop in tall and low blocks and with a given system. When the Yorkshire Development Group was set up by Womersley, and I got the job of being development architect, it was a great relief. Womersley had been city architect of Sheffield, and his great achievement had been Park Hill and Hyde Park, which in 1962, when I got the job, was under construction. He sat on the Parker Morris committee, and he really believed those standards were a minimum and designed houses to be bigger. And he felt, what could he do next? He got together with David Jenkin of Hull and coerced Leeds as a third city, joined together. And the idea really was that there must be some logical way of doing their big program, which was going to be 10,000 houses a year, rather than by separate cities and separate sites. There must be some common method, the same as Nottinghamshire had developed the schools in the form of class. Next, please. I found that the Yorkshire Dales very encouraging and inspiring. They seem to be full of very manifest systems of great simplicity. Next, please. Next, please. Where out of single materials, in terribly simple ways, very sort of subtle and sensitive places could be made, because also, I suppose, unconsciously, one was really reacting against all the 50s Festival of Britain type thing, and one must also confess the schools and so on, with their variety, chaos, it seemed, of materials. One wanted simplicity. And these gratifyingly, these selected dark villages seem to suggest that. Next, please. As in fact did the cities, which had already had their great systems of housing, in this case back-to-backs. That was joint, of course, between two back-to-backs. Next, please. The sites, the idea was that one wasn't going to do a system that would do everything. The problem was really for the higher density areas, frequently, as in this case, this is Hunslet, or was Hunslet, to be demolished a second time. Urban inner areas, rather high density, often not very nice areas, a lot of industry. This seemed to me where the problem was. As I said, the existing formula was the seemingly unattractive tower block, slab block, terrace house formula. There was not a particular problem in doing the lower density housing around the perimeter. Next, please. So the system that we developed was really this. It was an awfully simple idea. It was really a family of, if you like, houses and flats, maisonettes and flats, which you could stack up one above another and next to each other, and to which you could add your towers and bridges. And because, as with that earlier LCCC idea, because they had physically to be related, they naturally shared dimensions and services. Next, please. And were therefore suited to factory production, whatever the factory, whatever the material. So this was the family of house types, if you like, of various sizes, to look in different ways, with different internal arrangements. Next, please. That was how they could be, some of the ways they could be stacked up. Next. And that was the sort of basic concept of how they might be subdivided. And what we did was to get together a program of 4,500 houses to be built over 3 years. And we got together a specification, a performance specification, and asked 3 very carefully selected contractors to show how they would be able to create these volumes, whatever material it might be, although we knew 99% of the existing systems, and the idea was to exploit existing systems, were in fact concrete. We hoped that maybe the cladding at least might be pressed steel or something, but concrete constantly was the best buy. Next, please. We did a sort of a design for the pilot site, which is this, Fleet Street in Leeds, one of 8 sites. Next, please. And construction started. This was about 1956 or so, 68. Next, please. And as it was underway, and I'd been 6 years in Leeds, I left, and coincidentally at that time, suddenly, a whole series of events happened. The 4 cities had all been staunchly Labour, and it was a great joint Labour exercise which the councils enjoyed. And 2 new Conservative councils immediately withdrew and abandoned their second sites. Next, please. There was almost a stop in the production of housing. There was an enormous cutback in the housing programme. Whereas before, high densities had been encouraged and subsidised in the centre of towns, there was a swing against high densities. And the final disaster, of course, was Ronan Point. Next, please. All in 1968. So, suddenly, in the first site in Leeds, where people who'd painfully waited to be rehoused in Hunslet, for which they still retain some affection, they were moved out. the gas heating was ripped out. Electric heating was put in, to be followed rapidly by paraffin heaters and condensation. Next, please. The decks never really became streets. This is one of the mysterious illusions that so many people had at that time. It seemed such a wonderful idea, such an obvious metaphor for connection, for holding a place together. They really never became these wonderful places at all. Next, please. And together, between, I suppose, well, it was really the problems of high density, the problems of, for some reason, on the continent, people can cope with high density. The people living there are systems of management. In England, people find it very difficult, and there seem to be inadequate systems of management. So a whole spiral, and I should add the other major aspect, which was that signs of bad workmanship started to appear, so that one can't say that it was any one of these things, but the bad workmanship, the problem of living in high densities, the heating problem, the cost of heating, and finally, which I mustn't miss out, the architectural side, beyond the deck side. One had somehow got it wrong. One had somehow thought that these dark buildings were sort of natural to Yorkshire with its sort of austerity and dignity and so on. People actually wanted something softer, more adaptable, more cheerful. And one realized that one had been not totally rational in this complete insistence on one material, one colour. And the buildings were severe. And I think I learnt one thing, which is one of the perhaps sort of modern movement fallacies, this feeling that if the theory is right, if the dogma is right, then the buildings must be all right. I'd actually hoped that this was a sort of new vernacular, that it had some inevitability, that for sort of economic, practical reasons, these sensible, reasonable buildings would appear and would seem to people manifestly as reasonable and sensible as the Dales villages, and people just didn't find that so. So there is an architectural ingredient in it, an important one. And they are now about to demolish these buildings. Next, please. There are some things, I think, that one can, at least I can, retrieve from this. One is, I still believe that one should realize housing in whatever technique is actually objectively appropriate. Maybe for a small site of 50 houses, you even have to have brick and pitch roofs. Next, please. Hardly see that, but that's a system of timber frame houses which are virtually one-offs, although they're sort of systematized. And the other thing I still believe in is that actually quantity is an inherent part of the housing formula. It's quantity and quality, and I didn't say it, but I meant to make the point very strongly at the beginning that in the housing division, with its enormous emphasis or supposed emphasis on quality, quantity was felt to be really the enemy. Has been this split, which I think has been perpetuated, and there is sometimes, I think, an almost willful insistence on the need to separate the two, and yet one can think of so many historic examples of lovely building done in great quantity in terms of housing. Next, please. I think another aspect which I still believe in is that housing it should have an ordinary quality, and that one should aim for it. It should neither seek, on the whole, except in very special situations, it should neither seek to be sort of high architecture, nor sort of low populism, if you like. Next, please. And finally, I think, in spite of these setbacks, one has to sort of continue to try to progress. next, sorry, that's the end, that's the last. That's it.
Lastly, Richard Rogers, I won't say he needs no introduction, he probably needs a long introduction, but there's a bit of time. Lunch last week he said he was going to talk about industry. I have a sense idea what he's going to talk about. I haven't a phrase of my own to introduce him with, but by accident stumbled on a bit of hijinks from bizarre architecture, and coupled that with a remark that somebody made to me the other day that you look like the Leonard Sax that introduces those pseudo-Victorian what do you call old-time music hall things with a gavel, and so I will introduce Richard as that modern master of mechanomorphic metaphors. Richard.
I really didn't want to be here at all, as usual. But I was told that I had to be here because they wanted someone to pillory. It was absolute. So we'll talk about images. That's what I was asked to talk about. But then when I'm talking about images, it's difficult to compete against buildings which were built between 5 a.m. and midday. And I really am full of admiration for that. I find that it's really sort of quite amazing how one could actually answer those sort of social programs. I'm going to show some slides, but not about building or high-tech. I have great difficulty with the word high-tech. I can't actually understand what it means. I'm going to talk about a component basically, a bracket. Can I have the first slide, please? When we first started as Team 4, we started with traditional materials, and you build a number of houses. Generally, as far as cost, time, and relationships are concerned, very unsuccessfully, to a point where really I was ready to give up architecture, at a point I've arrived at a number of times in my life. And then one final fling was when in fact, Peter Parker approached us and said, I want a factory in 10 months. And it was quite clear that we couldn't use the brick, and that we'd just finished a brick building, a number of brick buildings, which we'd lost control of yet again, and where I remember the newspaper had been painted black for the DPC, and we hadn't found out until we were being sued, or nearly. And I remember very well standing under a tree on Hampstead Heath and crying and saying, this is it, I've had it. I'm not made out for this sort of thing. And then we tried to build the building on the left, which really was standard components off the peg, RSJs, expressing sort of minimum quantity of materials to do the job. Maximum effectiveness, speed, cost, those days, 1966, £4 a square foot. And it was a success. And we thought that's great until about 3 months later when they started to open up the side, which is on the right-hand side. And we realized it wasn't really a success because however good the client was, the original client, he'd already sold it to somebody else, and that somebody else wanted windows. And this form of thin, tight skin which had been sort of put together just couldn't stand the usage of the people which were working in that building. So from then on I started to look for a different way, a way in which one could create a flexible sort of interior, but also that it could be reflected on the outside, that it wouldn't matter terribly if they put an edge-mast section window through your perfect dollhouse-like elevation. Next. On the left is the last building we finished for InMOS, a microchip and on the right is Boberg. And both are made out of component systems and partly are out of off-the-peg systems, but only partially. Specifically, Boberg on the right, Centre Pompidou, which is big enough to have its own specially made components. These are not off the peg any longer. They're obviously time, cost, control are all part of the philosophy. But what we're trying to create is a expression which not only had a sort of technological excitement, which we were excited obviously and have always been excited by the whole idea of technology, but also something where the framework was sufficiently loose to allow for change and yet sufficiently clear to give a certain permanence. Next slide. On the right was the first sketch, in fact it was a competition drawing for the structure of Boberg. Two columns and a structure. Two columns were on the outside, in fact two walls really of structures. One was for mechanical services, another one was for movement systems. And the whole complexity about how to take a load of the beams spanning 48 meters between two columns, which were resolved on the left-hand side upon this system, which is in fact originally designed by Gerber, a German engineer of some 80 years ago, and the design of the bracket on the right. Now there are hundreds of designs, obviously thousands of designs for a bracket system, and at that point there's this complex mixture between what is measurable and what is not measurable, between the science and the art. And the column, which is a water-filled column, and the bracket, and the way to minimize the load, and the excitement for us anyhow of working with engineers to try and work economically to span the 50 meters between the columns by pulling down on the right-hand side with tension cables and by expressing all the parts. And in a sense, going back to reliance controls before, again a key element has always been to try and express, to create a language out of these parts, to make it legible from the outside. And that to us is very much the way that we look at the whole component system. What do we like about components is a certain clarity of legibility, that if you look at it you can see what each part is actually doing. Next. And the study, and here again, the whole study of detail, the idea and the excitement that we got in actually forming the different parts and trying to shape those different parts in a way which was both met the, shall we say, functional needs, but also the architectural or the art need. And so that is the Gerberette. That is a 10-ton bracket, and that's a casting. It was designed by Arabs together with ourselves and built in Germany by Krupp. And those are the Gerberettes out in the wilderness, and this relationship between the hard technological elements and people or trees and elements. And next. And the making and the sort of design, for instance, the hole through which the column goes through, which has to be loose enough for the column for the bracket to fit over the column and to fit into place, and which has a million different shapes, but only a few of them which relate to the total building. Next. This is the bracket, the sort of the T-bracket, if you like, on the right. You can just about see the person on the right, which gives you the scale of the overall element. We learnt a lot from sort of studying Victorian stations, from then studying some of the Japanese work that had been done with cast steel, and basically three forms of steel were used. Next. The beam, in which all the tension pieces were solid steel round, which the compression pieces were tubes, and then all the nodes, or the Gerberets, which were castings. And this really created the language, the sort of continuity throughout the building. And here's one of the beams, one of the 50-meter beams coming through Paris at night time. They would arrive once a week, at 3 a.m., and every time they arrived, there would be a group of engineers and architects having a party, and lots of other people would turn up because it was an occasion. It was part of the excitement of building out there. Next. And they're putting it together dry, in other words, so that everything could move. There were no expansion joints because every piece, rather like a vertebrae, could move. Everything moved just so that it could take expansion, contraction, and lateral and vertical loads, diagonal loads, and the scale of the pieces in relation to the human being, and that each piece was expressed. In other words, as if you look at the diagonals in the beam, so each diagonal expresses the different force that acts on it. Next. The Gerberet being dropped into place at right angle and swung round. One of the strange sort of parts of this building in Paris was that though we were all foreigners there, once we started to build there, it became very clear we had to use French materials. Apart from anything else, our client was the Minister of Production, and his interest was obviously French production. But very soon we realized that we were going to have major problems with the budget. We had a fixed budget, and that the French industry were going to get into a ring, and we clearly formed a ring, and we were sufficiently young and furious to try to break that ring. And when we started to check out, we realized, in fact, that nearly all major buildings, whether it was the Friotto's Olympic steel structures, or the bridge over the Bosphorus, all these were pretty clearly, to our mind, rigged prices, and that it was going to be very difficult to break through this ring. And we went to British Steel, American Steel, Italian Steel. They all said, of course, you're just green. And the only people who dared to break the ring, of course, were those liberal organizations, Krupp Steel and Nippon Steel. And we were basically made allowed to use Krupp as long as we didn't tell anybody we were using Krupp. Except that, as in France, all buildings are built by Algerians, and the average French building site looks like an Algerian encampment, and they build very efficiently. When the Germans came in with their bright new blue uniforms and built with great big new huts and suddenly put a diagonal system of huts all the way across the site, it was pretty clear, even though we had a member of the French building organization actually painting out the word Krupp on all the pieces of steel as they arrived. Apart from anything else, of course, these brackets look just like cannons over Paris, which the press soon got hold of. And between blonde hairs against Algerians and so on, we had great difficulties. Next. These are the pins that go through these brackets. And again, this whole question, the excitement that we get of seeing the way the pin fits in, the shape of the pin, the way you tighten it, and so on. Next. And actually the shape and the forms and the relationship between this whole strange line between art and architecture, between art and science, between how you actually design each of those pieces. What is technology? Next. On the left, the expression which I was talking about all the forces within the building which are expressed very clearly, very legibly. This whole mixture of layering, of different levels, of the outside, the inside, and so on, and the middle. And the end, which is the rose which takes other pieces like the escalator later on, or which takes the flags, which takes the exhibition flags. Next. And the last slide, I mean, the success in a sense, and obviously there's an argument which will go on about Berber in a sense, is that it is very much used by people. It does have not 5,000 people, which is what the brief. It sort of talks about 50,000 people per day at the maximums, and an average of 25,000 people, and that technology doesn't specifically have to be a hard or soft thing. It depends how it's used. I had difficulty with one of the remarks which was made, I think it was by Martin, which said something about buildings which are ordinary. I don't really know what ordinary is. I find ordinary rather boring. In the end, I think one always tries to stretch further than one can reach. That's part of the excitement. And that one is trying to create all the time sort of answering certain responses. So again, going back for a moment to the sort of elevation, what one's saying is, on Boberg, it doesn't really matter if the government changes, because even though they've ripped out most of the facades, actually you can hardly see it. The balance between sort of transformation and permanence is such that it doesn't that part doesn't matter. They're going to add another escalator, good. So that part starts to answer one of the problems which sort of intrigues me. And it becomes a public activity. It's no longer an elite activity. It's no longer the South Bank. It's no longer in the sense that the South Bank answers a specific element. The cultural South Bank answers a specific element, which is high culture. But yet, really what one's looking for is something which one can do at any time of day. And if the right answer is to use refined forms of technology, that may be the right answer, but it may also be whether it's mud bricks. It doesn't really matter what it is, as long as it is done in an appropriate way, and as long as one can get a certain enjoyment out of doing it, out of actually participating in not only in building it, obviously, but in visiting it, in going up the escalator and viewing it out to Montmartre. And in a sense, it's just a process. The technology is a process. Obviously, the end result is something which is enjoyment for those who use it. Thank you.
It's 11 o'clock, and I hope that those who haven't got a catch trains will let us all have half an hour's questions and discussions. I think there's nothing between the speakers and the audience except one sentence which confirmed one of Richard's more improbable statements that he several times thought of giving up architecture provided his student in the second year, and I know he did.
Yes.
I don't know if anybody would like to open the discussion. Chris Libby.
Just as a response to the last speaker and the overall discussion, last I was very interested to know what Lawrence would say. I can't remember your quote when you mentioned stone erection, and whether we could replace in a very same quote 10-ton brackets. I don't mean in which I thought immediately a brass structure, 10-ton brackets. You said that you didn't know what all directions. You didn't understand that. My view, or your last, is that maybe you're using the wrong word. You certainly understand the sense of the vulgar, the sense of the common, and the common man. And that these two words get very confused. I think perhaps some of the people were seeking for the ordinary and meaning the common and vulgar or something. There is a dialogue there, and I wouldn't want you to business.
I'm not at all against. I actually accept what you're saying. It's not the only point that I think it's difficult to achieve. You may not. I don't specifically. Look, going back to the 1940s, that was not an ordinary period. I mean, it was an amazing period. The whole spirit of that period of sureness, the belief still, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, the belief that science could actually answer many of the ills of society was something nothing ordinary. I think it was immensely exciting. I think that there's a danger today to forget that it did answer some of those problems. It obviously did not answer all. It obviously, each period looks back and learns a certain amount and forgets a certain amount, and makes different mistakes historically. But I'm in no way am I trying to say that we are less ordinary. We are just as ordinary. I'm certainly interested in the whole idea of people and that relationship to objects, vulgar or not. I don't. But the only thing I'm worried about is the idea of, I suppose, completely shying away from the problem. A problem does exist. Problems do exist. Those problems are urban problems of space, if you like, at one end, and at the other end, the problem of housing for sufficient people. At another end, the fact that 100 years ago, the average death expectancy of life in Britain was 20 years old. I mean, these are problems. It does interest me that we have moved over 110 years from our 20s to our 70s. It does interest me that why we've interested and so on. All these I find very exciting and gives me a certain sort of interest to move on, shall we say, a certain optimism, if you like, towards moving on. I just think that there is a certain danger of saying, well, really what I want to do is to be ordinary, because I don't know how you do it. I don't know what it means. I can't quite think about how an architect, artist, so on, in any other period said, actually my aim in life is to be ordinary. Doesn't that reflect an unbelievable loss of confidence?
Can I respond to that? What I said. I mean, I get good grade, boring.
I didn't say.
Cheap thing. I think there is a case there are special rules for demand. I think particular poetry moving and actually exciting about the condition of time is the ordinary kind in a way like just words, this quality is actually exciting. Now, trying to go along the truth, I don't go on festival housing attempts to be exciting. So I'm trying to do the wrong thing in the wrong place, trying to do that. And it's often very enough.
Somebody has to be ascetic at some point. And having been ascetic, it becomes common, vulgar, and very quick. And I think that's what I do now.
I don't want to break the seal, but I can see this whole thing want to do a discussion.
I agree with you. I was most impressed by Mr. Martin's description of the Hertfordshire school. And what I'd like to ask him is something quite simple. Does he go back? And how they stand?
Simple answer, yes, I have been back on occasion, not much. Those that are maintained are standing up well. The first school is magnificent. They treat it as a historic monument and it's absolutely first class, and the headmaster enjoys it and the children enjoy it, and the colours are just as I showed you that first school. Other schools that for all sorts of reasons, maybe just the headmaster, lack maintenance and they're rather poor. So again, you have a very wide spectrum. The county's also faced by enormous cuts in expenditure, and such things, replacing felt roofs and so on, is going to be very difficult. So that's the answer.
Sorry, if I could just follow on that one very briefly. Are there any sort of, to your mind, intrinsic design errors that have sort of turned up over the period?
Try and be rude and ask the questions to be heard in our end. Okay?
No, I stand by all the principles that we have for the Hertfordshire schools, and I believe the problem is simply that we have not yet got them across. In a way, the best lecture that was ever done on this was Alvarado here in that early 26th of September, came here, lectured on the beauty of standardization. And we attended that lecture, and I think it was enormously influential. because that was 1946. I can give you the actual day, actually. No, it's just interesting, this, though, because this was in my view, this is a lecture that I've always remembered, and I cannot trace it. It was, in fact, Thursday, the 26th of September, 46, and he spoke on the moral question of how to create a more humane standardization. He saw it as the architect's task to do this, or else they, the architects, would be, quote, designers hanging on the last end of a production machine. He showed that an architect was architectical, above technical, and that it was his job to think in terms of two kinds of standards, the one concerning things not directly related to man, you know, the crux stuff, and the other concerning things related to man, which was also chairs and light fittings and so on. He wanted flexible standardization so that we could have stress the permanence of change and the need to change the so-called permanent. He wanted buildings that would grow during a long life, which almost echoes what Roger was saying about this Pompidou building that goes on changing and changing and changing and changing, and will go on changing and changing within a beautiful classic framework worthy of the Greeks, really. And this is the way I see it. I think it's a total integration between Greek classicism and Japanese humanity, and I think we'll get the two. And the Japanese, of course, it's marvelous now that they're onto technology, because they're going to make superb buildings before long. It's a great time coming.
John Norman, I don't know whether this answers Chris Libby's point, but I was fascinated by both Martin and Rogers, because Martin seems to, his experiments in housing seem to be failure by Richard, seem to be on hold for success. I think it's not actually why should this be? I feel that the answer might well be in not the means, but the ends. One was seeing housing as housing, as homes, and numbers, rather than, well, I was looking at Yorkshire houses that are now being knocked down, sorry, Martin Richardson, Rich Rogers, I thought the public buildings have been on hold very successful. And I think that, as I was about to say, but I think the answer that the ends have been clearly understood on the public buildings. But when it came to the housing, the ends were not clearly understood. They have not addressed, for example, the real problems. And I think that the debate we're in at the moment seems to me to be concerned with the ends, what is it rather than the means. Housing is not necessarily numbers, but it is actually something about quality of home. It's a private thing to be kind of extreme. It is in contrast to the civic, which is the public realm, and the private realm is something different. And I think that the failure over the last 50 years in housing, especially industrialized housing, has been the failure to analyze what one means by home, what is standard. Well, on the whole, I think Richard has picked up what the public realm requires, and this is why it's successful. Sorry, what was the
Can you reply? Can you reply Richard's question?
I think I would call it not a question of means, it's a question of ends. I would say the ends will not be numbers, but it would be your definition of what home is and what it's doing and how it functions in the private realm.
and what the private realm means vis-a-vis the public realm. And I think it's what we find. It's not something bland, it's uniform. And that's why I reject sort of hard schools. It's that, this is a universal application that can apply to any problem. There are institutional problems, and I think that what marks the architecture of today, and the problems of today, from, say, 10 years ago, is that we have a great appreciation of the politics of it. I mean, and the man as a political animal, as man as a man in society, a society made up of institutions, and the understanding of the institutions, how they, the architect's job in representing institutions, in reifying them, manifesting, it seems to me the most interesting problem today, and it's one which we see addressed at the AA. And it's perhaps the failure to understand the whole of the institution that brought about the demise of the industrialized housing around us today.
It's germane to the discussion, but let's not always to take the whole discussion into another field. So closely connected to the sort of historical field of the sea. David next, and then
I'd like to go back for a moment to the answer that Bruce gave to the question about how the hard schools stand enough. Not that I disagree with what Bruce said, I want to enlarge it. The Hertfordshire schools are a very loose term, an awful lot of them have been applied. There are only a fairly small number which I regard as vintage Hertfordshire schools, which hit people between the eyes in the early years after the war. And they hit people in the eyes because of their aesthetic impact. Not because they were technically awfully interesting as they were aesthetically very impressive indeed. People know, using aesthetics in George York's days, all in looked at Templewood School, and others like him have admired them out of all proportion. They had an aesthetic impact because practically everything was designed specifically for the school. Everything from the columns, the beams, the cladding, the wash basin, the urinal, the WC, the coat pegs, the colours especially matched, an absolute total unity for education, for a particular attitude of education, a particular thing the children were actually doing. I don't think it's time to mention it. And it was absolutely all focused on that, everything, the colour mixes and everything. And when it all gelled and came together well, it was absolutely a knockout. But that makes them awfully vulnerable to the passage of time. I've been back to several of the Hertfordshire schools over the years, and some have fared pretty bad. They're very vulnerable because they were so specifically designed. It is exactly in opposition to what Richard Rogers was saying about his building. He hopes that his building will survive a multitude of changes because it's been designed, well, he was trying to better than I can, in a way that is susceptible to change without actually falling apart, so to speak. It is absolutely difficult to go around some of the Hertfordshire schools now, which finally perhaps are even more impressive than they were originally. To go around the interior to see colour changes, furniture changes, lines being changed, all that kind of thing happening, which they disintegrate very quickly. And the aesthetic impact is lost. So there's a lesson there.
And if one individual next week will follow that, which is to record the remark of Geopontis made when one of his small schools, class schools in the United States, he was writing the evening paper to describe the efficiency and functional qualities of the school compared favorably with any others in Europe. He went on to say that architecture is about ideas too. What's the idea of the school in the past so clearly? The answer in the literal translation, it sounds stupid today, it's still used, was the idea of this architecture is the care of a great country for her children. Pretty heavy stuff.
What I have to say is probably completely out of place. Architects, fellow problem solvers. Our first three speakers, all compliments to them. They thought, yes, problem solvers, yes, modernism, present or past or post. Yes, Charlie James could say better words than I. But I work in London as an architect. I live in Paris as a cartoonist. And 4 days ago I was working in the Pompidou in the library. I couldn't sit at a table because they were full. The carpets were full of people sitting on the floor with their books and their pencils writing things. The Saltimbanque outside, the jugglers, the men with the red noses were there. We, I would say to you, ladies and gentlemen, are privileged to sit in this room. There are not many rooms where we could sit likewise with a man who is probably the only one in this century who has built a public building that people love. And by God, they love it. You may hate it or love it, but you can't ignore it, and they do love it. I would drink to him. Few will achieve that.
I understand. I'll see you afterwards.
When I go into my Indian, I can buy David Nate's Cuticle.
Yes.
Still.
Sure, it's okay.
No,
David Nate's what? Oil?
and you can still buy on the same level.
Oh, yes?
I mean, that's a
Oh.
continuation.
You can go to the architect, so you can still piss and go to this one.
We did do other things as well.
Chairman, a very gentle thought. Three of the speakers in particular speak to me who allow their component design to form a marvellous love affair with the manufacturing process. And I felt very strongly that the manufacturing process was coming through tonight in almost everything you said. It occurred to me, and I hope Martin will disagree with me if I got it wrong, but so this is something about Martin's presentation which would give an impression of perhaps intellectualizing the problem, and then in his own words bringing in 3 or 4 well-known contractors to see how they would solve the problem. And he rather hopes it might not be concrete, but it turned out very concrete. Was there this divorce between how the thing would go together and what you wanted, or was that what I mistaken?
I felt the structure of the engineer and him, and with some reservation about the split of the other 3 in some kind of field. The technology is an end, and certainly the building is very lovely art and very lovely memories. To me, it's a need in extend building brickwork. You just they can all be marvelous, but I don't feel that to make an art building has been made to make. I think there are other very exciting things to be done in buildings.
One important thing to say about the architecture, which I must catch a train, is that everything that is designed and made is owned and designed by the user. Owned and designed by the user.
This is a huge gap between the heart service store and the heart store. It's trying to make a use of time.
Never
The heart
makes a
store
building
is
much except the sand to water.
right. We've still got 5-10 minutes if everyone wants it.
Actually, it did sound well.
The good academics and if the prefab, well, it's the same, and it's quite. On the other hand, the break without having it. On the other hand, I respect the criteria. I respect the modernization. I don't respect the state as for example, they do that. We have first modernization of that with the outside models and what's
Oh, yes.
and I am addressing ladies and gentlemen,
us to mean. That's what I'd like to ask. You use the speaker.
It actually, the ancient lived in prefab of the latest designs. That attack was horrible. However, it was not horrible in any real sense. It was only horrible because we had cockroach problems with the eggs. And it was 5 years. Then we had cockroach problems. 10 years, this is the last one. Before 10 was gaining, and then after 10 it was a little bit bad. And on the other hand, I respect the high-tech, which is the separated myself
No meeting.
like and in this respect, I have an enormous respect. In this respect, I have an enormous respect. In this respect, I have an enormous regard for the points you are making, sir, about the tension for structures. And I would like to hear your comments as experts, much older and more wise than I am, about the possibilities of taking, for example, as a the micro as the most reliable element in the building, and looking at non-linear integrities, whereas you've exhibited some beautiful, potentially integral structures far beyond Jerusalem or whatever, far beyond the level, far beyond the particularly doom, etc. And I would like to see you expound a little bit on the possibilities of having possibilities of architecture in a space beyond measure beautiful, which uses modular elements in a certain sense, but elements which recognize that buildings are in motion. Is it possible you would, between you, ladies and gentlemen, or gentlemen, you might practically speak this evening, but ladies and gentlemen, make up the action. The Amania of the future.
Yeah, I think we have somebody who can answer them somewhere. A.M.Gear. Like the story of Prefabricated house. It charmed me beyond measure. And a house which has all residential exteriors. And I wonder whether he would like you to say something about how many of the houses are there, and whether we can buy them.
I don't know how to do that. I have no idea. It's only one car I don't have to do it.
It was the latest. Sorry, I have a taxi. We remain on a little taxi. This is not a concern.
What is an outcome house?
I know the man. This is Stanton Street there. That would be more or less like the last disaster.
I see what
How many survived?
I think it was actually, but I'm not quite sure.
Actually, 41 survived. 41,000 survived.
In my area, they had revolutions and riots and cheering because they didn't want to get out because they wanted to have clear life.
It's got white pins across the sea. They're not there. On the other side of the
They
road.
could have gone forever.
Somebody should say something. Nobody's really graduating.
Can I just say one thing about Archon housing? Sorry, if I may. It's just a change. In the area where I was brought up, nothing less than Cheam, they had practically minor riots because the local council wanted to demolish the Archon houses, and quite clearly they had a much longer life than I think it was 10 years or whatever it was, the 10 years. And they went on fighting certainly for another 10 years, and as far as I could see, they were as good as when they were there before, and the people absolutely refused. They ended up by having to get the police in to move them out because it was beyond the regulations which were set by those times. they were unbelievably successful.
Yes.
Cedric has been hiding behind a column all evening. You want to stay behind a column? Yes. Just check you out. It does allow, and because some people have got it that way, I'm going to try to wind up the discussion, or rather ask John Price to wind it up, but that when we end the evening, there's some whiskey going around, and those who can stay, do stay, and discussion may go on, but I'd like to let John draw some what it is. So there's one going to go downstairs.
My last train is gone. The next one's the milk
The
train.
children, one tree, one
Are you sure?
It's just a
The milk train.
Well, it'll be very nice.
Make some
Very nice.
benediction.
Who's thanking you?
No, go on.
All right, I'd like to thank you for including, obviously all our speakers, they wanted to come. And I think we have to do exactly that. I'd also like to hope that everyone can stay.
Find out good guy, I don't know the next time I do a talk, we'll buy his time.
I think there's some very important parts of the story which is missing because people weren't here. Great pity we didn't have Terry Cox or somebody talking about group working ethos which informed the Heart Centre. I would like very much to have heard more procedural make certain series of connections between some of the earliest and some of the latest work. I think that's another occasion. Probably to get Colin Lucas, who was, I don't know how you put the prime mover,